July 1997. Northern Ireland. Chaos. In Belfast, over the course of only several days, multiple attacks were carried out on security force members using assault rifles and other small arms. In Derry, hundreds rioted, launching petrol bombs and other debris at the police and lodges belonging to the Apprentice Boys, a local Protestant fraternal organisation. In Uri, a social security office was set on fire, and in nearby Lurgan, a train carriage was hijacked by masked gunmen before also being set alight. Furious protests, several involving injuries and fatalities to protesters and soldiers alike, engulfed the entire region. And none were more vitriolic than in the small, visually unassuming town of Portadown. All of the violence recalled the worst episodes of Northern Ireland's sectarian conflict known as the Troubles. But surely it should have no longer have been so. For this was 1997, 4 months after the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, seen as having brought an end to the brutal conflict which claimed more than 3,000 lives over the previous 30 years. So why was all of this occurring now? The answer was to be found right there in Portadown, because a long-standing dispute over an annual commemorative event had developed into something dark, something disturbing, and, while no longer unprecedented, which threatened to reduce all attempts at peace to little more than the exchange of empty words. The dispute had a name: the Drumcree conflict, and its echoes resonated all across Northern Ireland, stoking sectarian divisions once more over a cause many would dismiss as shallow, symbolic, almost dismissible, but not to the locals of the town. Portadown is located in the county of Armagh, around 24 miles south of Northern Ireland's capital, Belfast, and roughly an equal distance from the border with the Republic of Ireland. It was founded in the 17th century during the so-called Plantation of Ulster, as settlers from Great Britain, mostly Scottish Presbyterians, arrived to occupy the lands newly relieved from the Irish Gaelic aristocracy. As time went on, the north of Ireland came to be divided between the mostly Protestant descendants of the planters or other British landowners and the mostly Catholic Irish, who, for more than 100 years, were disenfranchised and unable to buy or own land above a certain value. By the 20th century, the religious divisions had evolved to such an extent that the communities lived separate existences within the same geographical space, an existence punctuated by residual suspicion and prejudice. And this was no different in Portadown. The town itself was, and is, unremarkable in its population size or general profile. It was founded in 1610 by a local land grant to a Protestant settler from Britain. The area came into the possession of Michael Obins, an aristocrat, around whom Portadown rose to become a market town. It later became a centre of linen production and a railway cross-section, and by the time of the Second World War, it had around 16,000 inhabitants, rising to around 22,000 by the end of the same century. And with the rise of the Troubles in the early 1970s, Portadown, like many other settlements, became segregated into neighbourhoods dominated by both religious communities. The Protestants lived in almost uniquely Protestant neighbourhoods, and the Catholics did likewise. Each had their own schools, played different sports, and perhaps above all, worshipped in different churches. This ultimately would be central to the Drumcree dispute as it reached its zenith towards the end of the Troubles. But it wasn't the only key factor playing a role in what was to come. You see, many Protestants in Northern Ireland at the time, and to this day, belonged to a group of organisations intended exclusively for Protestant male membership. This included the aforementioned Apprentice Boys of Derry, founded in 1814, as a tribute to the defenders of the town who succeeded in preventing its overrun by a Catholic army 150 years previously. But much larger than the Apprentice Boys is the more well-known Orange Order, an organisation with a presence not only in Northern Ireland but also in Scotland and other parts of the UK, and even in countries of the Commonwealth such as Canada and the United States. The Orange Order came to be closely associated with the factionalism with which the Troubles were so infamous, and many of the highest-ranked Unionist politicians in Northern Ireland, those favouring continued union with Great Britain, were members. This included both Edward Carson and James Craig, Craig, seen by many as the state ideologue and architect respectively, as well as most of the subsequent Northern Irish leaders throughout the first half of the 20th century. In fact, it wasn't until 1969 that James Chichester Clark became the first and only Northern Irish Prime Minister not to be a member before the post was abolished in 1973. Many well-known paramilitary figures and unionist activists also belonged to the organisation, as did the Reverend Ian Paisley, a boisterous evangelical cleric long considered the strongman of the unionist ideology. Paisley's influence on the Troubles was as pronounced as it was notorious, and this came to extend directly to the Drumcree conflict itself, which we'll get into a little bit later. Aside from promoting Protestantism and unionism generally, the linchpin of the order's existence is to commemorate the victory of the Protestant king William III, or William of Orange, over the Catholic king of James II at the Battle of the Boyne in 1690. To memorialise the event, the order conducts a series of marches every year around the 12th of July, during which its members dress in distinctive bowler hats and bright orange sashes and march traditional routes in the company of flute and pipe bands. But these marches have long been seen as provocative and triumphalist by Catholics, not least because several of them travel through districts which became almost uniformly Catholic amidst the Troubles. Offensive behaviour became a common feature of Orange marches over time, with many marches deviating from their route to hurl abuse at Catholic onlookers and, on some occasions, to deface or urinate on Catholic homes or clerical buildings. Orange Order and apprentice boy marches in Belfast, Derry and other parts of Northern Ireland have regularly erupted into bitter sectarian fighting, with Northern Ireland security forces struggling to contain the depth of enmity generated by the annual event. And despite its small size, Portadown became a symbol of the disorder, which reached a head in the late 1960s and continued in inglorious intensity through most of the following 3 decades amidst the height of the Troubles. You see, although the Troubles were the consequence of years of brewing animosity and festering grievances, many considered the start point of the conflict to be a sudden outbreak of violence which took place in August 1969. And it all started, you guessed it, with marches. But on this occasion, they were civil rights marches carried out by citizens who identified as Irish Republican, the rival ideology to British Unionism, and who were mostly of Catholic stock. Northern Ireland had, until then, regularly discriminated against its Catholic population in areas such as employment, housing, and other social issues. So throughout the 1960s, several demonstrations were organised by Catholics in protest at their circumstances. But these became the target of Unionist counter-demonstrators, and the collision course came to a brutal climax in Derry with what would become known as the Battle of the Bogside. The disturbances began when the locals of Derry's Bogside district demonstrated against the 1969 Apprentice Boys March, which, unlike the Orange Order marches, takes place around August the 12th. The Bogside was then attacked by Unionist locals, which led to a 4-day pitched battle between Catholics and both their antagonists and the security forces sent to quell the upheaval. It had long been a complaint amongst Catholics in Northern Ireland that the police and military favoured the Protestant majority, with their ranks being mostly composed by Northern Irish Protestant members. The Battle of the Bogside lit the fuse for a wider outbreak of violence, although what became known as the Troubles would steeply intensify after an even more notorious event 3 years later. On the 30th of January 1972, British Army paratroopers shot dead 13 unarmed civilians during another Catholic protest march in the Bogside, in what would become known as Bloody Sunday. With that, membership of the Provisional IRA swelled, and the group would go on to carry out attacks in Northern Ireland and on the British mainland in the years that would follow. Unionist paramilitaries, such as the Ulster Volunteer Force, came to prominence as well, who would carry out a string of attacks of their own, most of which targeted Catholic civilians. Although much of the most well-known instances of violence in the following decades took place in Belfast and Derry, few places in Northern Ireland were spared the brutality of the period entirely. Portadown, for its part, saw 45 people killed in the course of the conflict, mostly civilians, targeted in sectarian attacks by the IRA or, more commonly, by local Unionist paramilitaries. The county of Armagh itself occupied a prominent role in the conflict, largely due to its particular demographic profile. The county was predominantly Catholic and Republican, but the Catholic majority resided mostly in rural villages and along the southern border with the Republic Republic. South Armagh became a hive of IRA activity, especially snipers, some of whom would fire upon British Army forces and retreat across the invisible border into the territory of the Republic. The towns and major urban centres of Portadown, Lurgan, Craigavon and Market Hill were, in contrast, predominantly Protestant and Unionist. Despite being located in North Armagh and largely safe from such attacks, Portadown felt repercussions in other ways. In response to the perceived lawlessness of the south, many Protestants left the countryside and arrived in the county towns, increasing the existing Protestant majorities in places like Portadown. Local Catholics began to see their homes targeted by sectarian attacks and were forced to resettle, either by fleeing the town entirely or moving into what became segregated neighbourhoods in Portadown's outskirts. By vacating their homes, they left room for arriving Protestants to resettle, and the result was a town ever more divided, even as the intensity of the conflict would begin to relent at the beginning of the 1990s. But there was another, less visible reason why the violence in Portadown risked outliving the troubles elsewhere. Remember how the Orange Order had been founded to commemorate the triumph of the Protestant king in 1690? Well, in the years that followed William of Orange's triumph, commemoration of the event had led to regular brawls between Protestant and Catholic gangs. This was especially true of the lands nearby the Boyne River, where the decisive battle had taken place. While the Boyne itself was located in the neighbouring county of Louth, ironically now part of the Republic of Ireland, the most bloody sectarian battles largely took place in Armagh, with a more religiously mixed population. In 1795, a little over 100 years after the battle, one such clash between the Protestant and Catholic mobs in the Armagh village of Lochgall led to a Protestant victory, and the victorious gang declaring the formation of the Orange Order then and there, in order to ensure King William's victory would be commemorated throughout the ages. Lochgall, the birthplace of Orangism, today lies only 7 miles west of Portadown. So in addition to being subject to some of the most bitter displacements of the entire conflict, the town also just so happened to be the very bedrock of the Orange Order, whose annual marches were, and remain, one of the most contested features of Northern Ireland's entire sectarian divide. As the years progressed, clashes between the Orange marches and the Catholic locals took place all across Northern Ireland. On many occasions, the marchers resolutely refused to reroute their historic paths, even if it passed through areas which were by now Catholic and bitterly hostile to the sight of any orange sash and bowler hat. The possible resolution was for the Unionist marchers to scale back their parades, or under great duress, to find alternative routes. But many marchers refused to do anything of the sort and would continue attempting to march their old routes in spite of the order not to do so. And if there was one place that the marchers would absolutely refuse to budge, it was in the heartland of the order itself. Portadown would eventually become synonymous with one of the most bitter standoffs of the entire sectarian conflict. The stage was slowly being set for pandemonium. The Orange Order march to and from Drumcree Church had a long history, having first begun in 1807, 12 years after the establishment of the Orange Order in nearby Lochgall. At that time, the area through which the parade passed was mostly farmland, but even so, trouble had been reported by a local official as early as 1835. Magistrate William Hancock, himself a Protestant, reported, "For some time past, the peaceable inhabitants of the parish of Drumcree have been insulted and outraged by large bodies of Orangemen parading the highways, playing party tunes, firing shots, and using the most opprobrious epithets they could invent." Violent disorder became a consistent feature of the Orange March in Portadown, but the worst disquiet would be saved for the tail end of the 20th century. The marches, of which there would be several each summer, culminating with the 12th of July itself, had traditionally followed 2 routes. Those preceding the 12th ran the full length of the thoroughfare known as Oban Street in the northward direction towards Drumcree Church. A service would be held at the church before the parade would turn back via the nearby Garvaghy Road in a sort of U-shape toward Portadown town centre. The march on the 12th itself travelled in the opposite direction, starting on Oban Street before heading immediately south towards the town centre. The passage of each leg along Oban Street or Garvaghy Road would typically last no more than 10 minutes. minutes. But the profile of the area surrounding the route began to change in the 1960s. On one hand, newly built council estates sprang up, which converted the former farmland, which enveloped both roads, into residential neighbourhoods. And the demographic changes resulting from the start of the Troubles meant that this new district, by the 1970s, had become almost exclusively and densely populated by Catholics, the only such neighbourhood in the dominantly Protestant town. Not only that, but many of the residents now residing on Oban Street and the Garvaghy Road had been shunted out of their homes in other parts of Portadown. They were penned into the small estate, with the Protestant town itself on the front and Drumcree Church located to its rear. To the west lay various Protestant neighbourhoods, behind which was Lochgall village itself, and only a few miles east, in plain view of the estate, sat the planned town of Craigavon, named after Northern Ireland's first Prime Minister and a stalwart of the Unionist establishment. Craigavon dwarfed Portadown in size, and many local Catholics were sceptical of the former's existence, seeing it as a Unionist project which, in turn, had led to low Catholic settlement there when the town was established in the 1960s. The annual Orange March through the Drumcree estate was slowly becoming a pressure cooker, but for some time the locals of Oban Street and the Garvaghy Road simply had to put up with the marches. A paramilitary known as the Ulster Defence Association, or UDA, had a strong presence in the area, as did the Orange Order itself and other institutions of the Unionist establishment. In 1972, when British troops tore down barricades erected by locals on Oban Street, armed UDA members swooped in to secure the path for the marchers. This led the IRA to take notice, and gun battles soon erupted between the rival factions as the Troubles in Northern Ireland spiralled out of control. What followed, though, was a period of calm for several years. The UDA stepped back from intervening in the march, and the IRA turned its attention elsewhere. But the festering resentment continued and would come to a head in 1985. In March that year, Catholic residents of Portadown received permission to carry out a parade of their own for St. Patrick's Day, a small part of which ran through a nearby Protestant neighbourhood. But this was opposed by Unionist Mayor Arnold Hatch and the Royal Ulster Constabulary, Northern Ireland's then police force, ultimately stopped the march from taking place. In response, Catholic opposition to the summer's planned Orange March rose in temperature, and the RUC announced that the outward leg of the march through Oban Street would also be banned, and redirected instead to a parallel Protestant street. This led to Unionist fury, and more than 2,000 Orange marchers arrived in Portadown in July for the start of the marching season. Amongst them was George Seawright, a caustic member of the Belfast City Council, known for his sectarian rants, and who once proposed burning Catholics in ovens. With the aid of army personnel, the outward leg of the march on Oban Street proceeded, but not without severe violence. Catholic protesters attempted a sit-in and were beaten by the RUC, whilst, despite an army escort, the Orange marchers were showered with stones and other debris as they passed through the estate on both legs of the march. Multiple injuries resulted, and the RUC decided to enforce the ban on the Oban Street leg of the route from then on. But the situation would only get worse. The violence of 1985 marked a new point in the inglorious trajectory of the dispute, and the years afterwards would see it continue into an unrelenting downward spiral. George Seawright's rants made him into a target, and he was shot by Republican gunmen not long after, but it mattered little, for a new kind of beast had arrived on the scene at Drumcree, and this was the Reverend Ian Paisley, the towering clergyman whose speeches, often from the pulpit of his Presbyterian ministry, carried the full force of Unionist hawkishness with them. Paisley arrived in Portadown on Easter Monday 1986, 3 months before the summer marching season, with 3,000 Orangemen, including the apprentice boys of Derry, in tow. The group blistered past police and made straight for the Garvaghy Road, thereby reinventing the course of their own traditional route. As they did so, the marchers caused wanton damage to nearby houses in the estate. The RUC increased its presence and sealed off Oban Street, but they were attacked by the Unionist mob in response. Reeling from the violence, the police announced that some of that year's summertime Orange parades would be allowed to proceed down Oban Street with few restrictions. Unsurprisingly, severe violence resulted, with the police this time attacked by both the Orange marchers and Catholic locals alike. 27 officers were injured. In the years after, the RUC dramatically increased their presence in Portadown ahead of the parades, and temporary calm returned once more. Aubyn's Street remained sealed off for the marches, and in the meantime, the IRA and Unionist paramilitary groups announced ceasefires in 1994. But as you will recall from the introduction, the violence was far from over. In fact, it was about to reach new depths of depravity entirely. By 1995, circumstances in Northern Ireland had shifted. Peace negotiations were underway, and whether to uphold this progress or to correct the injustices of the past, the police presence seemed to finally favour the Catholic locals of the Drumcree estate. On the 9th of July, an Orange Order march took place. By now, the marchers had been banned from walking down Aubyn Street since 1985 and had been redirected to the adjacent Garvaghy Road, a Unionist area. But the parade had otherwise been able to continue its return leg along the Garvaghy Road, once the lesser populated of the two adjacent Catholic streets. On this occasion, however, they were prevented from doing so by an unannounced residents' sit-in. This time, the police sided with the Catholic residents, preventing the marchers from continuing their route back from the church through Garvaghy. This led to a standoff, and Unionist outrage exploded once more. Roadblocks took shape across Northern Ireland in protest at the events in Portadown, and only one day later, Ian Paisley arrived back in the town once again. Accompanying him was David Trimble, the other leading figure of political unionism at that time. The pair's followers picketed police lines, and the march was ultimately allowed to continue, albeit in silence. Paisley and Trimble seemed to treat this as a victory, joining hands as the marchers cleared the Catholic neighbourhood, although neither the Unionists nor the Republicans were content with the development, which laid the groundwork for an even greater clash the following year. Once again, the march was prevented from returning from the church through the Garvaghy Road, but this time, no less than 10,000 Orangemen swarmed the police roadblock, and violence again erupted across Northern Ireland. Hundreds of attacks on police were recorded, dozens were reported injured, and more than 150 arrests were made. As the situation in Portadown deteriorated, the decision was, again, made to allow the Garvaghy Road march to proceed. The resulting outrage would be equally as severe, this time felt by Northern Ireland's Catholics. Rioting erupted in Belfast, Derry, and Catholic districts of other cities and towns. The RUC responded with force, and the lack of faith in the police by Catholics grew once more, while support for the IRA, still on ceasefire, grew. Republican political parties pulled out of peace negotiations, and Catholics boycotted businesses linked to the Orange Order. The peace process now sat on a knife's edge, and Northern Ireland was firmly back in the crisis. The crisis continued to endure throughout the following year towards the summer of 1997 as the marching season drew close once more. By now, the entire state was teetering on the brink of a new, terrible conflict. Lasting peace was perhaps within reach, but negotiations were unravelling, and with them, divisions were emerging once more. Sectarian attacks grew, risking the re-intervention of the paramilitary organisations who, despite the ceasefire, had not yet given up their respective arms caches. Once again, all eyes turned to Portadown and the Drumcree conflict, with neither a resolution nor a clear plan for how that year's march would proceed now visible. The result was exactly as expected. The RUC once again banned the march from proceeding through the Garvaghy Road. The Orange Order once again protested, and Unionists across Northern Ireland once again carried out protests and roadblocks. And yet again, the government backed down, citing concerns over the wider spread of disorder. On July 6, 1997, thousands of police and British soldiers forcibly removed residents from Garvaghy Road to allow the march to pass, having swept in the same morning to take control of the area. The event was broadcast live and sparked international criticism, as over 1,000 Orangemen marched the road on that day. Once they passed, residents' fury erupted towards the remaining security services. Stones, bricks, and Molotov cocktails rained down upon the RUC members clearing the Garvaghy Road. The violence spread, and with several marches still planned in Portadown, the IRA became involved once more, launching gun and bomb attacks on security forces across Northern Ireland. Rioters also attacked not only the police but orange marches elsewhere, and a number of orange halls were also targeted by arson. The violence lasted until the 10th of July, when the Orange Order decided unilaterally to reroute or cancel several marches. After years of violence and administrative indecision, the Drumcree conflict was now international news. But 1997 would also be the last year that the Orange Order would walk the Garvaghy Road, because what would happen the following year would feature an event so heinous, so disturbing, that the entire dispute would be reduced to what it had been all along: a tribalist feud, but which this time would come at the cost of 3 young, innocent lives. In advance of the 1998 marching season, several landmark events had taken place which, in theory, should have put a stay on the worst of the violence. The Good Friday Agreement was signed on April 10th that year, finally burying the 3 decades of the Troubles under a tenuous peace treaty. And in 1998 it certainly was tenuous, since its terms were by no means accepted universally. Several splinter groups of the IRA opposed the treaty, and one of these, the so-called real IRA, would go on to carry out Northern Ireland's worst ever bombing, the Omagh bombing, which took 29 lives in August the same year. Ian Paisley, the intransigent patriarch of the uncompromising unionism, also opposed the agreement, and his Democratic Unionist Party would go on to surpass all other unionist parties in Northern Ireland in the years that followed. Nevertheless, a new future was on the horizon, something given further hope with the establishment of the Parades Commission only a few days before the signing of the treaty, whose intention was to regulate all further parades, Protestant and Republican, from then on. But Drumcree had passed the point of a civil resolution. That year's marching season carried with it the same brutality as the previous 2 years had done. As it turned out, in fact, even worse. As always, the first Orange March on July 5th was prevented from entering the Garvaghy Road by a well-entrenched police barricade. The marchers dug in, refusing to return home until they were allowed to pass, and the circumstances rose in temperature once more. A splinter unionist paramilitary, calling itself Portadown Action Command, announced that the driver of any vehicle delivering goods to the Garvaghy residents would be shot, effectively placing the estate under a kind of siege. The standoff continued for days, during which hundreds of Catholic homes elsewhere were targeted by unionist mobs. Vehicles were hijacked and set on fire, and more than 600 petrol bombs were thrown. The rural village of Dunloy in County Antrim was attacked and besieged by no less than 1,000 Orangemen, and hundreds of rioters were arrested. Back in Portadown, the marchers continued their standoff as the week passed and the 12th of July approached, and on the 12th, everything unravelled. But not at Drumcree. Instead, in the town of Ballymoney, nearly 60 miles away and close to the Northern Irish coast. Ballymoney was a mostly Protestant town with a large paramilitary presence and had been the site of several actions carried out by members of the largest unionist group, the UVF. Many, if not most, of the Catholic residents had abandoned the town during the Troubles following threats of violence against them. Chrissy Quinn was one of the few who remained. Although Catholic, her partner was a Protestant and her 4 young boys had all been raised Protestant in order to, in Chrissy's words, avoid hassle. As it happened, 3 of them had attended bonfires on the night of the 11th of July, a unionist tradition to mark the eve of the 12th, and which practically all Catholics of Northern Ireland would give a wide berth to. The same night, Chrissy's home in Carnany, a Protestant housing estate in which she was the only known remaining Catholic, was targeted by a petrol bomb attack. The adults managed to escape the blaze, but the 3 boys inside didn't. Jason, Mark and Richard Quinn all perished, with 2 of them having succeeded only in finding their way to their mother's bedroom, where their remains were found. The oldest of the 3, Richard, was 10 years old. The Quinn boys' murders were met with universal revulsion. British Prime Minister Tony Blair denounced the attack as barbarism, and US President Bill Clinton extended his condolences to the Quinn family. British businessman Ken Bates offered a £100,000 reward for information relating to the attackers, while US Senator Ted Kennedy declared, "The Orange Order must recognise that its refusal to abide by the decision of the Parades Commission led to the murder of the Quinn boys." A similar sentiment was shared by members of the unionist community. William Bingham, a Protestant chaplain and Orange Order member, stated, "The violence we have seen, if that is Orangism, then many of us here would have no part of it. After last night's atrocious act, a 15-minute walk down the Garvaghy Road by the Orange Order would be a very hollow victory, because it would be in the shadow of 3 coffins of little boys who wouldn't even know what the Orange Order is about." But the mournful atmosphere was hardly shared by everyone. Ian Paisley was quick to denounce the murders as diabolical, but pedantically qualified his words by stating, "The the IRA have carried out worse murders than we had in Ballymoney over and over again. Yet, after the shameful event in Ballymoney, nothing could be the same again. Support for the Unionist cause in the Drumcree conflict evaporated as the 1998 parade season dissolved without a meaningful resolution. Unionist dissenters continued to riot, but the strength of their claim to the road had by now disappeared. The Quinn boys' funeral was held at the Catholic Our Lady in St. Patrick's Church in Ballymoney, and in one of only vanishingly few such occasions, thousands of mourners, Catholic and Protestant alike, joined the grieving family in their final farewell. Among the mourners were the boys' mother, Chrissy, their grandmother, Irene, and their surviving older brother, Lee, who'd spent the night of the 11th of July with his grandmother in the nearby Catholic village of reshaping. Despite William Bingham's word, some Unionists continued to demand that the Portadown Orangemen would be allowed to walk the Garvaghy Road in the years that followed. Attacks on the estate and Catholics elsewhere continued, and the year after the Ballymoney arson, the apprentice boys again carried out a long march from Derry to Portadown, where they immediately did battle with the awaiting police force. Violence by Republicans continued also. Only 1 month after the July 1998 events, the Omagh bombing took place in County Tyrone, massacring 29 people, including a woman pregnant with twins, and causing over 300 injuries. But not only had the harrowing attack in Ballymoney weakened the cause of the Portadown marches, but it also severely curtailed the draw of the Orange Order itself. The organisation's membership declined significantly from the following year, falling from a peak of 100,000 members in the 1990s to around 65,000 in the 2000s. Its decline was furthered not only by the inglorious shadow of the Portadown dispute, but by the consistent loutish behaviour displayed by some of its members throughout the decades of marches across Northern Ireland and elsewhere. World media began to document the Order's naked anti-Catholicism, with publications like The Guardian referencing the Drumcree dispute directly, as well as Ian Paisley's lingering influence on the organisation's positions. The Guardian's special report, The Poison at the Heart of the Orange Order, was published in the year 2000 and coincided with that year's Orange March on the 9th of July, amid revelations that members of the British neo-Nazi group Combat 18 had travelled to Portadown to support the marchers. Once again, violence erupted, just as it did 6 months later in February 2001, when Unionists marked 1,000 days of having been prevented from accessing the Garvaghy Road on the Drumcree estate. But that summer saw the last episode of rioting in favour of the annual march. Support had by now almost vanished, and although the Orange Order continued to campaign for a return to their traditional route in the time thereafter, and ever since, this has been consistently turned down by both the Parades Commission and the Police Service of Northern Ireland. Today, the annual marches continue to occur each July and August across Northern Ireland. In some areas, Republican marches have sprung up as well, and as a repetitive cycle, rioting has erupted as a response to one or the other. Yet in Portadown, the powder keg which erupted every year has relented, with the streets of the Catholic district of Drumcree now largely quiet, in contrast to the battleground they once were. In July 2024, the Portadown Orange Lodge submitted an application to the March of Garvaghy Road during that year's Gaelic Football Championship final, rationalising that the residents would be distracted by the match, thereby minimising disruption to their lives. The application was denied.